Hi folks, Photo Fisher here again, and this time I have a special project. I'm repairing this 1972 Fender Telecaster thin line. It's a reissue. It was built in 2004 in Mexico, according to the serial number. I bought it for about 150 bucks on Craigslist, and it needed some significant TLC and repair. So, the neck's in great shape and the frets have plenty of life in them, but the hardware, as you can see, I wish I had some pictures to show you before and after, but I've completely restored the pickups. They had a bunch of rust and corrosion on them. The pots and the selector switch crackled and hissed when I used it. I replaced all of the screws which had some corrosion and rust, and basically the finish had worn off of them. I put a nice polish and refinish on it with just some hand waxing is all. The neck is in absolute great shape. Frets are in great shape. Headstock and tuners are all in great shape. So for the most part, $150 isn't a bad buy, considering these go for 650 bucks used right now and 900 plus new on the internet. So what's wrong with this guitar if it's in great shape and the finish looks good and the hardware restored properly? As you can see, it's had a major fall, and this cut right here and this chip, the finish has even come apart. All right, delaminated from the wood, and you can see the crack goes all the way down almost to the input jack. So that's what we're going to refinish. It's worth going over the finishes used on Fender guitars. It's important to know what finish your guitar has before you attempt to restore it. Nitrocellulose lacquer, or nitro, was the primary finish used by Fender in the 50s and 60s. This is the finish that wears over time and now has enjoyed a resurgence with that retro look crowd. The yellowing and cracking is indication of a more brittle finish. Then, Fender began applying polyurethane, or just urethane, which is a very durable form of plastic, starting in the late 60s and is used still today. It took only 2 coats to replicate the finish thickness of many coats of nitro, and it provided much more glossy and durable finish. Then in the 1970s, Fender started using polyester. The chief advantages are like urethane: tough, scratch resistant, temperature resistant, and still allows the resonance from the tone woods to really shine through as pure as they can be. Well, come to find out, and as one would expect, each finish takes a special method and materials to repair a significant finish blend like this. In this case, the guitar has a polyester finish, so I've chosen to use Solarez Gloss Dual Cure Polyester Resin. That's what we'll use to fill in that big gap, missing chunk and piece. And for the crack, I'm going to try using a fly tie resin. It's ultra thin, so it's going to soak in there and get in the crack of the guitar. Hopefully not get into the wood so much, but then I'll be able to cure it quickly with a UV light. And pretty much it's like repairing a crack on a windshield. Right? I just want to put the glue in the crack itself and see if I can't just solidify it. I don't care if it adheres back to the wood or not. And in fact, I don't want to discolor the wood. So I'm going to test it on some wood before I apply any glue to the guitar body. So I don't want it to darken that wood along that crack at all. I've determined ahead of time that this Solarez ultra thin UV cure resin does not stain wood. Here you can see I've tried it on a piece of wood here, and it just basically makes the wood shinier. All right, and on this piece here I also did a sample of the next piece I'm going to use, the high gloss resin, polyester resin, UV cure glue. All right, so for this application I used the bone dry on that hairline crack that you can see that runs all the way across here. and I put a bead on top of it. It's soaked in a little bit right here, if you can see, and that's okay. Again, this is on the buttstock of the guitar, so nobody's really going to see it. I really don't want that to happen all the way across, so I put a bead. You can see that bead right there, all along that hairline crack, just to prevent it from chipping further. And then I'll sand that down and polish it later. And as you also can see, when I took off the guitar strap piece of hardware here, I chipped off some more of the finish. So it's a pretty fragile finish, so I have all of this to fill in, and that's what we're going to do next. Using a small craft brush, I've applied some of the polyester gloss resin just very thinly around the edge, so I can seal the edge before I start applying thickness to build this up. And I'm going to cure it with this UV light. I don't know if you can see the light there. I'm just going to cure that. It takes about 10 seconds to set that resin in. Using the same brush, I'll apply a thin layer across the entire base, and I'll build up from there, applying several layers, curing each one along the way. As you can see here, I've applied several layers of the polyester gloss resin. Looks like it darkened the wood, but if you get to another angle of light, you can see that it hasn't. It's just a reflection issue with the light I'm using. So I'm very happy about that, but we have a lot of sanding and buffing to do to bring that down to even level across the entire finish of the guitar. To bring this buildup of resin down to the near flush level of the existing finish, natural tendency would be to take a razor blade and to start going like this and just slicing some of it off. That's really not what you want to do. Instead, take the razor blade like this and scrape. It'll take a lot more time, but you'll get a much more flush finish, and you're only taking off micro layers at a time, and you can adjust as necessary. After a few minutes of scraping and using 3 of these single-sided utility blades, I've got this down pretty much level with the surface of the existing guitar finish. The rest of this process will take several steps of polishing this with finer grain wet sandpaper to get a glossy shine on this. I've moved out to my workshop so I can do some wet sanding. Here I've glued a piece of 400 grit wet sandpaper on a block of wood so I can get a nice straight and square sand without any rounded edges. And I've just applied it over the glued area and down that little crack seam there. And about 5 minutes worth of work, and now we're starting to see the fruits of our labor. You can see that now this is pretty flat and smooth. And now I'm going to take some 800 grit, some 1200 grit. I'm going to go up to 8000 grit wet sandpaper to get a totally buff, shiny sheen on this buttstock of the guitar. After a few minutes of buffing with 7000 grit sandpaper, and as you can see the repair section if you look closely in the light at a certain angle, but when you look straight down at it, it's almost indiscernible from the existing finish. We still have a bit of a satin finish on this, so the next step I'm going to do is buff this down with some clear coat car polish and do that by hand, and that should take it back to a good shine. Here I'm using Turtle Wax Clear Coat Auto Polish, and I've added some water to bring it and thin it down to the consistency of maybe thick milk or the top of sour cream, just a little bit like that. And I'm just going to hand buff the entire area where I have originally scratched it with sandpaper, and that should bring back a complete sheen to this. After a few minutes of elbow grease with the clear coat polish, you can see that the shine has come back to the edge of this guitar. Now, one thing that didn't work out so well was the filling and sealing of that crack. You can see that crack that goes all the way from about here. So you can see it better this way. You can see that crack line there. But at least I've stabilized that crack by putting some UV thin glue in there. And I've filled that big heart-shaped piece of finish that had cracked off. You can see that's completely smooth. And if you look straight down on it, you can tell a little bit where the finish is new versus old. But at least it's all stabilized, and that guitar is ready to go back into service.